Hello and welcome to the Next 100 Days podcast. My name is Graham Arrowsmith.
And my name's Kevin Appleby. So, Graham, today we've got Daniel Evans with us. What are we going to talk about?
That's a really good question. What we should start by is just to welcome Daniel to the Next 100 Days podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm Daniel Evans. I started a stock exchange and then I left it, and I get up to various things.
You started stock exchange. I thought stock exchanges were sort of old-fashioned things that have been around for hundreds of years, that were used to be in buildings in city centres. You just started one.
Yes. So don't get me wrong. So the Gibraltar Stock Exchange was, if we're talking comparison to say, London or New York or any of the famous stock exchanges people have an image on, they're of course giants, and Gibraltar's that big, but it's a licensed and regulated financial services business like any other that serves a particular kind of a function, and ours served a very, very niche type of a function, and it was also, I also saw it as an opportunity to pursue certain sorts of technological ambitions, and then a whole bunch of other personal ambitions when it comes to the idea of how you build the infrastructure of a country. So yeah, I'm a megalomaniac by nature, I suppose, but we'll see where that ends up. 100 days immediately made me think of Napoleon. So, it could go horribly, horribly wrong or horribly right.
There's one Napoleon on this podcast, but I don't want you to guess who it is. But anyway, Daniel, when we met last week, was it last week? Is it the week before?
I think it was. I've lost track of the days already.
But we met in a lovely environment, and at the invitation of one of your personal friends, but somebody whose business I'm getting involved in. And so I went along to the Royal Automobile Club in Pall Mall, and there you were, and we had a really right royal chat. And I thought you were, forgive the phrase, but you felt like I felt that I was talking to the Renaissance man. I mean, it's a bit like I could have talked to you about anything, and you had an extraordinary view about anything and everything. You'd done so many different things in your life, all of which seem to be quite interesting. You've already started us with the fact that you helped found a stock exchange. So, an interesting career, but go back to the point where you and the chap that we met at the RAC, you were together on the waves, weren't you? You were a maritime guy.
Oh yes. Well, so I don't know if I should share his name here or not, but we're both military. We're Navy reservists. He outranks me a couple of rungs, but we're both Navy reservists, and that's how I first met him. And actually, the funny thing is that when you're when you're going into training and you're spending regular time with a lot of these kinds of people, they especially in London where we're based, there's a lot of people who are up to a lot of different things, and you don't often really even talk about what goes on in our civilian lives. So I didn't know. We'll stick with first names. I didn't know that Phil was even had anything to do with gold, which is another area I'm looking into at the moment. I had no idea until about 3 days before that event, despite knowing him for at least a year or two. So yeah, I mean, we have all sorts. I think someone told me this at one of our leading hands. So it's a sort of second lowest rank in the ratings. Is a high court judge. We've all sorts of people, astrophysicists, and all sorts of incredible people in our unit.
You were quite unusual in the sense that one of the things that you got up to in your past was that you've worked on both sides of the political aisle, shall we say, in this country.
Yes. So I've already hinted at it, but my life obsession is to understand how to build a country.
Yeah.
And so when I was, I left high school, and I actually went back to my native Japan for a while. And once I'd sort of felt like I'd kind of done enough there, I sort of thought, okay, well, I want to kind of see what's going on back home. I want to squeeze more out of what was essentially a gap year. And I spent a very minuscule amount of time actually writing press releases for people like the Three Tenors at a music PR company just off Oxford Street. And at the same time, this was 2009 at this point. So roughly sort of February 2009, the sort of really the dying days of the Gordon Brown government, if you remember that sort of era. Kind of very similar to this era now.
Yeah,
I'll sort of point out. Remarkably similar to this sort of era now. So I applied literally to any and every member of Parliament's office I could find, just sort of saying, you know, here's who I am, here's sort of what I'm up to, you know, let me in. And as it happened, you know, I wasn't fussy. I literally joined. You know, I literally sort of applied to every party, every whatever. It just happened to be a Labour MP who gave me my first in. Roberta Blackman Woods, whose constituency was City of Durham, and she was an ex-university professor, and I think she maybe understood that I was not very ideological, and I was there just to sort of see what was going on, so for academic reasons almost. I think it helped that I knew to sort of walk in with a copy of, as it was called then, the International Herald Tribune under my
Kevin reads it every day, don't you, Kevin?
Of course I do. Of course I do. After the Daily Telegraph.
Well, this is the thing.
No doubt the Durham Times as well. So you'll know that constituency, Kevin. It's up your area.
That doesn't exist. It's called the Northern Echo.
Oh, all right, fair enough.
That's read by Sunderland supporters, so I don't touch it.
Okay, fair enough.
But,
so you were working for this MP, a northern-based MP.
Yeah.
She obviously saw in you something fairly special, so you could actually write her copy, if you like.
Well, they initially brought me in at sort of the very bottom of the rung. So I don't know if I was sort of, you know, intern or sort of nameless grunt number 2 or something, but that's sort of how it works. So you, as long as you sort of get a toe in, it's the same with anything. You kind of get to the next thing or the next thing and the next thing. And so I was helping basically deal with vast amounts of constituency casework. And then the next stuff came along was kind of, you know, policy research and, you know, research into some of the issues that she was interested in. It wasn't sort of too long then that I think maybe about 6 months that I kind of decided, yeah, I'm afraid I just don't really, I'm not on the same page as these people when it comes to, you know, full on socialism. And don't get me wrong, I believe people should be taken care of. I just think that the framing of it is incorrect, and maybe this sort of explains why I sort of crossed the aisle a bit, and then subsequently abandoned all interest in that sort of side of politics, and why perhaps I have some of the goofy opinions that we probably talked about at the RAC. But yeah, she was very accommodating and nice and gave me a good chance. But I ultimately just decided I didn't really believe in what these guys were up to, and if nothing else, the government and the whole atmosphere at the time just felt clapped out. Some of it, I ran an analysis of my own at the time just to sort of on the metrics of it. So almost thinking football sort of style, you know, who's up to what. And I discovered that the average age of a Labour MP, if I remember correctly at the time, was something like 57 years old, whereas the incoming lot for the Conservative candidates included, certainly the ones who then went on to win, was 37. It was considerably younger, and I might have gotten that slightly wrong. Maybe it's 47. But the point is that there was a good chunk of sort of youth or difference or change in energy, and
Mm.
you can read the winds as well as
And
anyone. They were going to be in government, and like I said,
right now, as you indicated, Daniel, it seems to me that we're at the end of a period where one government's kind of almost run out of fuel, and another one who probably doesn't deserve our support. It looks like they're young and fresh, and they're going to come in and sweep away the old guard. I mean, do you see the parallels? I'm sure you do.
I see a lot of parallels. The energy at the time, as people remember, was that Gordon Brown was basically a kind of an out of touch angry nerd who had run out of ideas. And Rishi Sunak isn't very angry. I'm not sure he's got the body weight to be angry.
But the rest of the comment applies, though. But
right,
yeah,
just out of ideas and exhausted and out of tricks. And I think these are people generally. I think people massively overestimate kind of how important or how sort of relevant and interesting and pointful members of parliament are. A lot of people, I think, do understand that there's, it's almost sort of the yes minister levels of, or the thick of it style of government, where everyone understands that there's certainly a huge amount of the civil service that keeps things ticking along and running, and that huge amounts of society, whether it's in finance or I don't know, just any company, so people running supermarkets, anything. There's a huge amount of society that is just not run by our government, and certainly not by elected government. But I think people really need to sort of wake up to the idea. Well, I say that I disparage the audience quite a lot at the beginning. Democratic sort of outlook on it. The masses waking up to anything, does that matter? No, actually. But if more people who were more interested in politics really understood just how little these people not just actually run things, but are even capable of running things, that there'd be a lot more disengagement with the entire process, and that would be for the better. And we might actually start to get somewhere, eventually. You can run looking down at someone's CV, for example, and you just think, okay, at an election, the idea is that you essentially have someone's business plan. They call it manifesto, fine, whatever. You have someone's CV in the form of their website as a candidate for whatever seat. And are these people who are actually capable of running organizations that have, let's take any ministry, there's 10,000 people working for them and budgets of billions every year. Are these people actually professionally capable of entering into that system and putting to work 10,000 people to achieve some goal? And the short answer should obviously come up as, well, of course they're not. Of course they're not. David Cameron was famously a sort of a PR man, relatively low-ranking PR man in television before he becomes prime minister. Does that scream executive, professional executive experience? No. Rishi Sunak did what exactly? Sort of, sure, he worked within certain rungs of the professional financial sector, but he never really built anything himself. He never actually had to understand more than just what the process is, but what it actually takes to build and create and move something. So it's the difference between someone actually generating for themselves a plan and a course of action that works, and Chinese whispers. If you've inherited something,
your experience of working with both sides of politics is quite it reveals so much. I mean, Kevin and I have, to my knowledge, Kevin, you've not worked in that arena before. So basically, the sort of knowledge, particularly in an election year as well, the way in which people are elected, and then, as you rightly point out, Daniel, that they're often given fairly big roles because of some sort of latent interest, or the interest that they've shown in, I don't know, energy or whatever, and then all of a sudden they become,
or they perform well on TV, or just they perform well on TV. I think that's almost literally it. And let's.
They're propped up though, aren't they, by
Of course they are.
bureaucrats, by the civil
Well,
service.
and not just bureaucrats in the civil service, but by the media, by the various other, by donors, by the whole sort of back end of what is really a sort of a leaderless, directionless type of politics. And I was watching the interview that Tucker Carlson did with Vladimir Putin, and make of that what you will. Fine, whatever. There's a moment in there where Tucker Carlson is asking this of Vladimir Putin: who do you sort of deal with? Who do you actually, who would you be going to in the United States government to actually try and figure out how to get some kind of a peace deal or whatever? And Putin, he basically comes back and says, well, the American system, of course, we're talking now about the American system rather than the British, but I think that for all intents and purposes, they're basically the same problems persist. And Putin basically says, well, there's no real org chart here. There's no one who's like actually in charge. There's no actual plan. And I guess that's kind of the point, is that there is no org chart. It's not obvious to look at the system as a whole and go, this person is clearly in charge. If we got rid of that person tomorrow, we'd be in real trouble, because from them, decisions flow, or there's a plan that they understand and have generated and are taking us forward on a course to achieve greatness. Any other line of work, especially in the corporate world or the military, you have clear organizational structures and plans and people who are responsible for executing them. And you need plans for contingencies, but what happens, who was responsible for what and where the decisions flow from. And that's just not how our government works now. There's no one who's really clearly, obviously in charge. And it's more or less, I think, designed that way. I think it allows a lot of people to basically take no responsibility for anything, but have a lot of visibility and a certain amount of money and a certain amount of ego stroked.
Is this sorry to cut in, but Kevin, is this something that you resonate with as well, or is it something that you don't quite follow?
No, I was just about to come in and mention quite a few experiences of my own, and where you've been working with politicians, Daniel, I've been on the other side of the fence working with government departments as a management consultant. A large chunk of my career was done as a public sector management consultant, working Ministry of Defence, Department for Transport, and NHS through the big areas. And working in the MOD was great. A lot of the time, the best clients were where the project was mostly the army. So the best projects were the ones where army officer had been asked for a short period of time to drive a desk. Didn't really know what to do. Come on, guys, help me, please. And they were the ideal client because they were open to advice, open to help, actually got things done. I flipped that around and say, working for civil servants, you've normally got the opposite reaction that says, we know how things are done around here. We don't want to change. We'll pay lip service to what you're trying to do. Go away.
I wouldn't be surprised.
What's the solution, though, in your eyes, Daniel? Because to be honest with you, we're not going to resolve this. But at the end of the day, we do have an opinion.
Ultimately, it's a replacement of running things by process with running things by executive decision making. And it's funny. This is something that kind of came up even by my own sort of era, I suppose I'd now call it, looking back. But this was something that came up when we had grown somewhat as originally from the stock exchange days early on. Fast forwarding a few years. So there were originally 4 of us who went to go start the Gibraltar Stock Exchange in 2013. And lots of overlapping roles, as you might expect in a sort of a startup of 4 people. my role back then was to design, one of them was to design a lot of the processes by which the stock exchange would run. So listing processes, how to onboard members for the stock exchange, all sorts of stuff, everything down to document management systems, certain types of human resources rules. There was even sort of a plan for what happens if Spain invades Gibraltar. Like it was, I mean, obviously totally impossible, but there were gazillion plans and processes that were put in place to think, okay, well, what happens if one of us gets hit by a bus and we need to get someone in to pick things up immediately, keep the market running, keep things smooth, etc., etc. And so fast forward a few years to, I think, to 2018 or something. And at that point, we then evolved into what then became the Gibraltar Stock Exchange Group. We were doing very, very well. We had, I think at our peak, something like 150 employees in 4 different countries, not just at the stock exchange, of course, but a range of different businesses. And I'd long since moved on from the function of writing, rules and processes to kind of doing almost whatever I wanted at that point. And I came back to Gibraltar one Easter, I think it was, and I brought with me a prospective, potentially very interesting prospective partner and client. And as you'd expect, licensed and regulated business, of course, you follow all of that. You have to follow all the rules you then have agreed with the regulator for how you are going to run things internally. I bring this client back, and there's a discussion about how to onboard them, blah, blah, blah. And eventually I talked to the person who we then made responsible for, it was like head of listings or head of membership or whatever, whoever it was, someone who ultimately worked for me, even, if it wasn't immediately obvious, but who came back to me saying like, oh no, well, we can't do this in that way. We have to do it in another way. And I'm sat there thinking, no, I wrote the rules on this. Yes, I understand that the rules say X, Y, Z in, subsection 37, paragraph 2B, part C. Yes, I understand that. Thank you. But here's why you're wrong. And here's why we can actually proceed doing this in a very particular, here's how we can actually proceed.
Yeah.
And that, I think that taught me something very quickly, which was like, oh, yes, we're sort of, yes, we're sort of a real boy now. Yes, we're a business that's up and running and doing well, but there's all sorts of people who are going to be afraid of making a decision that steps outside of what are very, very particular parameters. And they're also not necessarily going to understand those rules in totality to navigate them, to make an actual sensible business decision.
So if you follow your story about, how you set up the rules, and then a little while later, not that long later, you almost had a sort of a mid-tier guy quoting back to you why his interpretation meant that you couldn't do what you really wanted to do to bring in new business.
Right.
If you write that large to a country, and we go back right to the beginning, how on earth do you create a country as opposed to a stock exchange or whatever, a business, whatever?
Yeah.
There's not an easy sort of pathway there, is there? It's not like you can just say, right, well, I'll do it by fiat, by executive fiat, almost like, Biden on his first day, coming in and sort of saying, I'm not going to do this, 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 and this. And then a few years later, everything's falling down. Not that he knows that, but basically everything's falling down. So the issue that I have with all of this is, how on earth do you create a country?
Well, ultimately it has to come right from the top. So one of the reasons I realized that we were in a spot of trouble, when it came to bringing this business on, was that this guy had done, actually, was it a girl? I can't remember anymore. Just it might have been a woman at this point. Now I'm thinking about it. She'd done exactly the right thing, which was ask questions about how this was going to play with the rules, how this was going to interact, and ultimately how the regulator might take a view on approving that final membership admission, how are they going to make an ultimate decision? And that's kind of the point, is that in any country, to be sovereign is to be the ultimate decision maker in any process. Right. And sure, as a business, we had a lot of our own power. We could do a lot of our own things, but ultimately the regulator was going to have a say. Ultimately, we'd written all sorts of rules about how we had to behave in accordance with all sorts of, not necessarily regulations, but with pre-agreed processes that we put in place with our regulator in Gibraltar. And so if you're looking at a country and writing it large, like you said, ultimately that comes from the top. And at the moment, there is no real obvious top. There's no one who actually says, okay, the buck stops with me. Yeah. If this all goes, wrong, ultimately I am accountable. That's just not how it works in any of our, whether it's the UK or the US or wherever. And so, of course, Vladimir Putin is confused when he looks at the US and says, I don't really know what I'm dealing with here, because there is no sort of obvious org chart. It's not quite clear who's doing what or why.
I think the word confused is not the right word there, is it? It's confused simply by the morass of problems of dealing with an entity like the US and the UK and Europe. Sure. But it's because, I don't know whether it's been designed that way, but we've had.
I think it has. I think ultimately it has, because if you have a very obvious, okay, maybe we're stretching the analogy somewhat, but imagine that you have kind of like the trains. You have some company that is brought in to manage an asset and to serve a function. And now imagine that you have a company, let's call it sort of UK Government Limited or something, that applies to manage the assets, which is the entirety of the United Kingdom, with all of its people. You do a stock take like William the Conqueror, you do a doomsday book, you find out what you've got in your inventory. You go and you harry the north to sort of, put down sort of the previous employees who might be unhappy about the change of management. You essentially have to think of this country as, okay, who's managing this as an asset? What is the organization which is managing this as an asset? And if you have someone who is ultimately the CEO or the king or the sort of founder, or however you want to put it, that person concentrates power, wealth, and accountability, because ultimately their head gets cut off, or the barons go and to make them sign something or whatever. That person has a level of ultimate accountability and aligned with their interests in a way that is not seen in the way that government at all works, whether it's the elected bits of it or the civil service bits of it. But you do get that in, let's say, a business or a startup.
Are you a pessimist when it comes to our political system?
I suppose the simple answer would be yes. But at the same time, I think this is a condition that can last for a very, very long time. People talk about things like, the collapse of the Roman Empire or something, and they forget that thing, depending on how you want to chop it up, that thing lasted into Constantinople and to the 1400s. So I think there's no reason why the way that our governmental system works can't persist in the form that it does for a very long time, and we don't just devolve into what is essentially a sort of a third world sort of crap hole.
Another one of your strengths is in sort of digital assets and so forth, and you have a sort of a body of work in that area. Is there something about the way in which we're headed in terms of artificial intelligence and so forth, the way in which we're making decisions potentially going forward, possibly better decisions than hitherto, might be a way to help an incumbent minister? Is there a way in which we can utilize sort of the digital changes in terms of country building. Is that something that you would consider, or your experience?
Well, AI isn't my field of expertise at all.
Yeah.
I suppose that I could comment very broadly and say that it's a tool that I would expect if you are data driven and trying to create better and more accurate ways of projecting how some event or another is going to turn out, or how the prices of this or that are going to work, or what the likely outcome is of some policy decision. I can see why that would certainly help prop up some minister who ultimately still is just a cog in the machine rather than the sort of prime mover of any of these kinds of decisions.
So what is then your digital asset understanding? How have you got involved with that?
Well, I'm afraid I'm one of those weirdos who was messing around with Bitcoin for a very, very long time. So I certainly wasn't one of the first in, but I first really started messing around with it in, I think, sort of summer 2010. And I should have realistically done a mathematics degree, but I chose very self-indulgently to do a philosophy degree so that I could study very obscure areas of logic. I thought it would frankly be a lot easier as well. So I'd have loads of time to go work in politics and music and whatever else I was up to in London. But I ran up against a lot of the computer science types. And because I was, everyone knew even back then I was obsessed with the idea of how to build a country. They sort of said, okay, well, why don't you have a look at this? Here's this currency without a government. It's set up in a particular way that I think you'll find very interesting. I'd gotten very obsessed with cryptography, ultimately, from looking at certain things like set theory, then looking at the concept of infinity, then getting obsessed with prime numbers, and then prime numbers are very important for in cryptography. And I got very obsessed with a whole bunch of different things that then pointed me to look at this as an idea. And back then, I didn't know what the price was, or I wasn't really thinking about it as a use of currency. It's not like I was buying hand grenades and cocaine on the dark web or something. Although, of course, I know how, but I barely even drink alcohol. So
we'll have a link in the show notes to anybody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, how to hand grenades and cocaine with Daniel Evans. That's what you can call the episode: hand grenades and cocaine with Daniel.
Oh, well, we could do, but
you get a few more clicks.
I do like the idea of actually a nation building in a sense, but the way in which you're integrating parts of your career and the things that you've actually done in terms of the stock exchange and your involvement with digital assets. Well, just take us to the end of that story.
Yes, sorry. Yes, digital assets. So I saw very quickly there was a phenomenon with Bitcoin. There was a feature within Bitcoin that allowed you to attach information to transactions. And people would call these colored coins. And so I got very interested in the idea of okay, well, what exactly is the data that you can attach to those kinds of transactions? So it'd be kind of like writing a note on, I don't know if you can do this anymore, but back when pound notes were made of paper, you could write a note on them and, draw a mustache on the Queen or something. And it would
get you in jail, Daniel. I think that defacing the Queen's head.
Our government is so weak and out of it. I don't think they would even sort of think to do it.
You could sign and put your telephone number on. They still wouldn't chase you down.
They still wouldn't do it. No. It still wouldn't happen. But you can attach more information to a pound note to carry more information or a different message than just I promise to pay the bearer the sum of £5 or whatever. Yeah. And so that's kind of how I looked at those kinds of digital transactions. And so the bigger picture there was, here is a system that is decentralized, and that carries with it a whole set of different, not just power dynamics, but different risks that I took a view as being better for the financial system than the current way things are set up. So I was asked, Keith asked at the beginning, I thought stock exchanges were, sorry, Kevin, what am I talking about? Kevin asked at the beginning, I thought stock exchanges are sort of these old crusty sort of, institutions that have been around forever. And yeah, that's basic. Yes, they basically are. There's virtually nothing in terms of process or the setup that has really changed, I would argue, since kind of the days of, the tea shop or coffee shop or wherever the first London Stock Exchange was set up. Now, they've certainly digitalized a lot of aspects of that, and the London Stock Exchange itself at, Paternoster Square it's not really where the stock exchange is. The stock exchange is a set of servers in a whole bunch of computers out by, I think, Heathrow or something, or wherever they are. They're set up in computers somewhere. But huge amounts of the process are basically the same. And I mean, even more recently, we ran into this problem. Do you remember the whole Wall Street bets and diamond hands and sort of that and Robin Hood sort of fiasco that happened a couple of years ago, where a whole bunch of people from a Reddit forum called Wall Street Bets basically discovered that they could buy a bunch of these penny stocks and sort of screw over some hedge fund for a whole ton of money. And it sort of devolved at certain points where, if I remember correctly, I think Robin Hood as a sort of a broker. So it's this kind of like phone app broker that allows people to, buy 50 quid's worth of, stocks and shares. They, as a broker, they had to, I think, put up an extra, I think it was like $3.4 billion that DTCC as a clearinghouse was asking them to put up as essentially risk collateral in case the trades didn't work. And they had to sort of put a pause on all sorts of trading that went on. And this made a lot of people on the Wall Street Bets side very suspicious that the government was coming in to basically squash them. They were trying to screw the working man out of, taking advantage of, rich billionaire hedge fund boys making some, foolish decision. And the simple matter of it is just that actually our financial system is set up in such a way that they really were just managing risk and really were just trying to figure out how to make transactions work in what is essentially a very clunky way, and where failed trades, even at some of these absolutely ginormous banks, are very regular and cost them billions every year. So the setup, if you're trying to buy something, so imagine that you're in the supermarket. Imagine you've put, like, I don't know, whatever, your hand grenades in cocaine. You've gone to Sainsbury's to get your hand grenades in cocaine, and you put them in the trolley. And are you in fact at that point the owner of those hand grenades in cocaine? No, like, you haven't bought them yet. They're in your trolley, but it'd be very, very, very strange if someone stuck their hand in and said, "Oh, you've got the last bit of cocaine. I want that. You haven't bought it yet, so technically you don't own it. I'm going to pick that out of your trolley and put it in mine." You'd think that was very peculiar. And that's kind of where a lot of people are. They think that once they sort of clicked a button or, placed a call to their broker to buy something, they think that they've bought it, and they actually haven't. So, sorry, Graham.
No. I think where this whole thing kind of comes together is that we've got a sort of a nation building desire on your part. We've had some really interesting reflections on politics and on digitalization and the sort of the freedoms that might come from that. But the one area that we haven't quite touched on just yet, and you mentioned it earlier, this idea of gold, and Phil's got this business that's linked to gold, but you've got this sort of frontier desire to go out there and create for yourself and for other people value from gold. Tell us a little bit about that, because presumably if you're successful about that, then you might well be in a position to create the nation that you're looking for. And perhaps you can start with I don't
this
know,
one.
Northumberland.
Start with
maybe.
this nation.
Yeah, Northumberland's ripe for it.
Oh, sure, why not? If the king wants to make me the Duke of Northumberland or something, and
That would
give
seem
me
reasonable.
a charter to, go and build Northumberland.
Kevin could second you, particularly with your your hand grenades and cocaine habit.
We've got a Duke of Northumberland already.
Ah,
He's got no power.
well, that can be changed, Kevin. So, but going back to the point about yourself, Daniel, you've got
Sure.
this ambition, something to do with gold. Tell us more.
Sure. Well, so a very long time ago, I used to be in mining. So this was after I left university, and not actually myself physically digging the hole or anything. Like, I'm spying sort of, dukedoms here and whatever. The digging can be left to people with accents like yours. That's how it works, right? Like,
every offence taken, but go on, carry on.
well, that's all right. My Welsh grandfather from rural Carmarthenshire would probably sort of be rolling in his coal mine, but yeah. So a very long time ago, I was in mining, and that was sort of an accident. So I'd taken the view that when I was going through university that. And I think this is more important for anyone young these days, even more so than it was for me. That I took the view everyone's got a degree, everyone's sort of doing whatever. The financial crash in sort of 2008 had sort of just happened, and I'd taken the view that I needed to so actually go and have a look at something that it was very easy for me to just get into quickly and at sort of bigger fish in a smaller pond sort of idea. And I thought, okay, great. I can work out what happens after that. I can use this to go on to the next thing, etc. So when I'd mentioned before, I was in Japan for a while when I left high school, and I was talking to this very, very old man who had been in Japan when that was an emerging market, in South Korea when that was an emerging market, and he was just talking to me about how Mongolia was going to be the next amazing thing. That's where he was going to go set up and do things. And I then sort of fast forward a few years from that. I remembered this conversation when I was reading in the Financial Times about how Mongolia had this absolutely ginormous mineral wealth in virtually everything you could think to dig out the ground. That here was a country that was pretty much building itself from the ground up. And literally, I suppose, with the mining. But it was democracy, very literate, because of that's one of the things the Soviets did right. They forced everyone to learn to read the propaganda. So very literate, young, energetic population, and it was easy and accessible for someone who had a Western education to just go in, because there was no real structure there. No one was sort of closed off. There was certainly no like graduate schemes or whatever to sort of wrestle a million other people with a gazillion people doing gazillion degrees, looking all exactly the same. And I thought, okay, great. Well, here's somewhere I can sort of sink my teeth into and have a crack and see what's happening over there. So I got into, and so as mining was the big industry, that was essentially what I spent a lot of time investing in from Singapore, as it turned out, when I left university. So yeah, 2012, fast forward through all the stock exchange years and all the other stuff. And I still have a lot of these contacts. And so someone sort of came back to me the other day and said, well, there's this project out in Central Asia. I'm going to be very circumspect about kind of where and what's going on, but here's a potential project out in Central Asia. And, they want to sort of develop their country a bit more and internationalize a little bit more. They're very worried about Russia and China, as you'd expect. How do they sort of essentially pursue kind of a third neighbor policy? So third neighbor policy is something from Mongolia, where they're nestled between Russia and China. How do they diversify their business and their alliances and everything else away from just being squashed between these two giants? And so, yeah, that's kind of the view of a bunch of different countries. And
I'm looking at. I don't know if I've got the permission, but I'll try and snag this and put it into the show notes. But basically, it's 200 years of global gold production, and currently at the moment, China's top of the league, followed by Russia, Australia, Canada, United States, Mexico, Kazakhstan, South Africa, Peru, Uzbekistan, Ghana, and Indonesia. So if one of those sort of areas is close or nearby the sort of Central Asian area that you're looking at, then you can tell that these are the current leaders in gold production.
Well, the beauty with gold, unlike, something like coal or iron ore or something, is that you can dig up enough of it to put on a helicopter and take it out. For it to still be valuable to do that, to do it that way, or a private jet, and just
Yeah.
fly it out to like Gibraltar or Monaco or something, and
Yeah.
then sell it in the West. So, or Singapore or wherever you want. But that sort of that came along. So actually, the meeting I took before I went to where I first met you at the RAC was actually just across the road at the Army and Navy Club,
Mm.
and I was talking with this prospective partner there about, okay, what exactly do we do? How do we set this up? And then, if things go well, the next step after that is to think about how discussions have already started, but it'll take a lot longer. The discussion after that is how do we help this country start their sovereign wealth fund? And so, it's slightly batty to me that there are countries out there sort of in the world that are, I look at this and I think, okay, well, why don't I just do it for this country? Like, I don't see why I can't just, okay, maybe I have to go to build some other country first, and, the British Empire style, come back after the Raj has been sort of appropriately sort of set up, and come back to this country,
Well, it sounds a bit
develop.
like, well, you've kind of not quite, but had some involvement in at least recognizing that this country might be beyond your current levels of skills, but nothing stopping you taking those skills, and there's plenty of them, to take out to another country and help them develop, particularly when they're rich in minerals, etc. And that would then actually create wealth within their country, and hopefully that would be distributed a lot through their people, etc. So that,
Sure.
I think that's something definitely worthy. But we've believe it or not, Daniel, we've got to pretty much the end of our current chat, and I think the one thing about this conversation is that you've almost tantalized us with the sort of ingredients that it would take to actually create a country. We've talked about digital, we've talked about using the resources that country has, about the political systems, etc. And it's been a fascinating conversation, Kevin.
It certainly has. But could you create a country in the next 100 days? Don't think so.
Not right now. Napoleon could have, but maybe one day. Caesar could have. Who knows?
Yeah, well, I mean, you might come back as a Caesar. I mean, you never know. I mean, God knows how this country might implode in the
I'd actually
meantime.
argue that, we touched on digital. The way things work now on a global basis, companies are global. If you're starting up a new tech venture, a fintech company, if it's only setting its sights on one country, will fail. It's going to look global. Now, all of these organizations are global, not country based. I just argue that it could be very, very difficult to set up a country as such in that kind of environment.
You're probably right. I think that any development of certainly of this country, any solution that came to this country, would certainly be a seismic shift in the same vein of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the changing out of East and West Germany into the reformed Germany as it exists today, or the Germany as it existed post-war. I think we would have to have change on a level that would make a lot of what this country looks like almost unrecognizable from what happened before. And that's not entirely uncommon. The Americans have reformed their country at least 3 times in the past. The French are on their 7th republic or whatever it is by now. There are certainly ways of overhauling the governance of a country while retaining enough of what existed from it, but making it almost unrecognizable from what happened before. And that almost involves it almost involves essentially just retiring out. And I think that's the way you do it. You'd have to treat a lot of our current government essentially like Stasi officers, and retire them to their gardens to never set foot in the public arena ever again. They're going to have pensions. They're going to be fine. They're not going to, be swinging from lampposts. That would certainly not be desirable. The point would have to be that you can do these in peaceful ways. This has happened multiple times. You really just have to have someone who has enough force of power and will to go, okay, no, this is how it's going to be. You are not going to be here. We're not going to do anything to you, but you just cannot come back. And the ones who were there for careerist reasons stay. If you joined the party because you had to become a school teacher, that's fine. But if you did it because you were a true believer, I'm sorry, but that's just no good.
Well, isn't there a case that there's so much going on now in the world that is digital and global that you just simply can't regulate it? No? You can't go and tell companies like Facebook what to do because one government just can't control the rules for a community that is worldwide.
Well, Facebook and I don't think that's true. I don't think ultimately the likes of social media, the people who are the ones who are really kind of the power making people in America, for example. I think if you want to understand how power works in almost any situation, you have to go to look at where the decisions come from and the values come from. So, and that I think comes from a mix and mash in America of the universities and the media, who certainly promulgate the messages. I think it comes from, you go to the brains of the operation. When it comes to certain sorts of tech companies, actually, there are always people who are going to be influenced by others to do certain things. You can frankly go to the servers and destroy them. There's an awful lot you can do to control the
opportunity. I mean, there's so many seeds of thought here, and I guess Daniel, you've been a fascinating guest. As I called you, Renaissance man. You have got interest in lots of different things, but the core of of today's message has been about, if you like, nation building, about country building. And I think there's so many little things there that I think once you've put those things together, you might make a real impact in this country, in Central Asia. And I think if you do, then that will give you sort of a sense of the things that you might be able to bring back to the UK and other countries to make them more efficient. And let's hope you do. Today, Daniel Evans, you've been an absolutely first-rate guest today on the Next 100 Days podcast. Thank you.
But Graham, some very interesting views there.
Yeah, it was a fascinating conversation that we had at the RAC Club, and Daniel's got so many almost like strings to this particular bow, but the bow looks a bit like country making, and I think fascinating. And you're absolutely right. You're not going to do that in the next 100 days, but the whole idea of this is, here's a man who's potentially taking on a much bigger project than most of our guests are, looking at. There will be people like, last week's guest, which was Kathy, where she basically was looking at the way in which people's minds work. Now, in this particular case, Daniel's potentially looking at the ways in which he can bring his experience and potentially investments and so forth in the way in which he can create a country or the essence of a country that would actually operate in a reasonable way.
But I think some very interesting reflections on the way countries like the United States or the UK are essentially dysfunctional. And we talked in the UK about that split between the members of parliament, who effectively have largely not got the skills to do the job. I would really dislike having to be the leader of a party, then having to pick a cabinet out of those 300 people that somehow managed to get themselves elected, and probably had all the skills to get themselves elected, but no skills to actually run anything. Now, it's run by the civil service. But
Yeah.
then you get interesting things coming along, like a crisis like COVID.
Mm.
Who sorted all the stuff out in the
Mm.
COVID crisis? Well, the civil service.
Mm.
Government had to go directly to some very large organizations who knew how to implement projects. Well,
Mm.
go look who did Project Moonshot. Civil service were involved, but essentially Deloitte ran it.
I think there's a lot of talented people out there, and whether or not we face, or when we face the next um, COVID type crisis, uh, we're probably going to be in a better position to handle it. But I suspect if it is a typical COVID type thing, not typical, an untypical COVID type thing, it'll be much more deadly. So
Mm.
instead of only affecting those people who have comorbidities, it might be affecting a whole lot more people. And so, there are worries. So the the sort of structure of society, structure of a country is really quite an interesting topic. It's a question of whether or not you believe Daniel has the skills to get there. I mean, who knows? At the end of the day, somebody will have to think about these things in a near future when, for whatever reason, we're impacted by something or other, whether it's a rock from space or whatever, that changes fundamentally the way in which we are potentially going to have to be governed.
Mm. And you've got an interesting thing. You look back to that COVID crisis, you had the Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, being
Mm,
very vocal, having to stand up, having to tell people what we were going to do, okay, having to take advice from a lot of scientists and so on. But you have a leader of the opposition who effectively is silent
mm.
and doesn't say this is what we should do because, frankly, these politicians do not have a clue in areas that haven't been rehearsed for many, many years. They can't do the job.
No.
And all that the leader of the opposition was capable of doing, and probably did a very good job of, was saying afterwards, oh, we shouldn't have done it like that.
Yeah,
You never told us what you were going to do different because you
no, I
didn't
know,
do
and
it yourself.
no, no. I
And
mean,
that's fundamental problem, Graham, that
mm,
none of these folk know how to actually run anything.
it's been a fascinating subject, and look, if you've been listening all the way through to the end here, to this particular podcast, you may have your own views about how we should govern the UK, how we should govern countries, and I don't think Daniel was particularly one flavour rather than other, but he was sort of indicating some of the things that would structurally need to be altered, and you know what, it's a conversation. It hasn't hurt anyone. So the whole idea of this is to have those sorts of conversations within the structure of this podcast, and hopefully, whether it's your mind, whether it's your business, whether it's your finances, hopefully Kevin and I can bring you really interesting people who can make the next 100 days in your life a lot more interesting. So today I've been Graham Arrowsmith.
I've been Kevin Appleby. Goodbye.
Goodbye.